Welcome to the mood board for 99.94. I'm Jarrod Kimber. Play the things. All right, let's get starting with some mood board action. Australia win by 4 runs against Afghanistan. That's probably not what they came into this game hoping was going to happen. They wanted a big, huge net run rate boost, and they got a slappy, weird, messy, almost accidental win at the end. But they got points, so, they've got to take those. Clearly, everything is now out of their hands, and that is a little bit annoying. But really, from the moment they lost to New Zealand in that first game, this tournament has not been completely in their, in their hands, in their destiny, in their fate. They've just had to see what is going to happen with the rest of the tournament as well. They had a pretty evenly matched game against England. I don't know. I hadn't done the full numbers on who was the favourite in that particular game, but at the very least, they would have thought they had worst case scenario, 45% chance of winning that game. Maybe 40% based on some of the games they played against England. So losing out to that particular game is obviously a huge blow to them. And then the Ireland game, that should have been a big net run rate game. They completely destroyed Ireland's top order. And then Lorcan Tucker just smacked them around for ages. So they've had their chances against New Zealand. Even against Sri Lanka, Stoinis gave them a bit of a net run rate boost. But obviously Finch was at the other end, struggling a little bit in that particular game. But where we are now is that it comes down to just a simple equation. We don't have to worry about net run rates and working out algorithms. If England beat Sri Lanka, England go through. If Sri Lanka beats England, Australia go through. So, that's kind of easy, isn't it? But one team actually went through. New Zealand are the first team in the semi-finals. The game against Ireland was pretty much an ideal run out for them. Ireland were good enough that it made New Zealand play all the way through, but they still won comfortably enough that it's not going to bother them at all. Probably the sort of game that Australia would have wished they had a couple of times in this tournament. Devon Conway's form is a bit of a concern at the moment. He made 28 from 33. I thought he batted really oddly against Sri Lanka. And a couple of times in this tournament, probably since he made runs in that first game, it just hasn't looked like everything's moving in the right direction for him at the moment. The other problem that they had was that Josh Little's hat trick meant that Jimmy Neesham and Santner didn't get as much batting practice as they would like, but Darryl Mitchell made some runs, so that was good for them. It might have been a good chance for them to give Milne a run in the tournament, but perhaps because of Ireland's weakness against spin, it just made more sense to pick the best matchup and win that game comfortably. All in all, New Zealand go into the semi-finals fairly confident. Kane Williamson even making runs, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But they've had a fairly smooth tournament other than the game against England so far. Let's just go on to Afghanistan, who I feel like I have barely mentioned all tournament, and that's probably because 40% of their matches have been washed out. If you remember, I had Pakistan up a few spots higher in my power list than I think a few other people would have. But I was also concerned enough to mention that they might be too high and point out that the fact that they had only played one game. Since then, Sri Lanka beat them easily, and I started to waver a little bit more, but I actually thought they bowled really well against Australia today. I'd love to give them a big, huge exit interview, which I'll be doing for Ireland in a moment. And I suppose in some ways almost Australia as well. But I'd love to go into that in detail. But the thing is, they've only played 3 games. I almost feel like I haven't even done a preview on them yet. But basically on paper and on the field, they profile as a bowling team. They average 22 with the ball, but they average the same with the bat. and also at about the same strike rate. So they're very good at not letting the opposition score and taking regular wickets, but unfortunately, everyone's doing the same thing to them. And when they get to this level, I'm not even sure their batting is that strong. But their bowling, I do think, holds up quite nicely at this level. If we just have a look at the batting card today, you can see that they've got players like Usman Ghani and Ibrahim Zadran, right up the order there. But those two struggle to strike. I'll explain that more in a minute. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to pack around players like Gurbaz and Gulbadin today, but obviously he came in. But those are the more attacking players they're trying to match up with these defensive players, or longer form players, I suppose is the best way of doing it. Gulbadin is really a throwback to how Afghanistan used to bat. Like, he's one of the old, everyone is a number 8 player who plays for Afghanistan. They've tried that method of just throwing a whole team of Gulbadins out there, and that hasn't quite worked. And they've also tried the method of trying the more traditional batters like Ghani and Ibrahim, and that hasn't quite worked. And so what they're looking for is this match between the two of them, and I'll show you what I mean specifically. So this Afghan batters in the last 2 years, you can see bottom right hand corner, these are the two guys that average over 30, and both of them have strike rates under 110. In fact, I think they're both at 108, almost exactly. You can see there's only one other player who has a batting average over 30, and that's Najibullah, who's obviously, that's the dream, to have a player averaging over 30 with a high strike rate like him. But you can see the other 4 guys who do the majority of their batting all average under 24. And you can see some of them strike better than others, and they have various problems. But that's the thing. They're not producing guys who can average 25 to 35 and do that at a strike rate of 120. And they're not producing multiple hitters who can average 20 to 25 and strike at a strike rate of 140 or 135 plus, or whatever that may be. Which means that it's not really working in either direction for them. And today, obviously, they were massively saved by the Rashid Khan innings. But have a look at Ghani's innings. He was 2 off 7. Ibrahim was 26 off 33. I think there was a question in the comments already about Ibrahim playing a match-losing innings. It's Ibrahim actually stretching out their batting at the moment that they need. And so you can definitely see that and say, well, he struck at 78. But this is not a normal team. It's not just about efficiency with Afghanistan's batting. It's about actually making sure that they're batting all the way through to the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, right? They need to get right to that end. And part of that is finding top order players. And so it's very clear that, there's these two methods, they're trying to bring them together and hoping that more players come along. If you look at the history of Afghanistan cricket, they've never really produced specialist batters. And the original issue they had was basically throwing up a bunch of guys who could hit. Now they're trying to find specialist batters at least to match them. Until they can find these proper batters who can average, decent amounts with strike rates that are not a huge problem, they're really not going to be much more than a spoiler team, I think, when it comes to these sort. It doesn't mean that they can't. I mean, they almost beat Australia today. They can certainly do that. But if we're talking about a team consistently winning, it's really hard to consistently win in T20 cricket if you can't regularly make 160. And this is not a team built to regularly make 160. It is a team that can defend 140, though. And that's why they still have so much success. And you look at that innings today, and it was a bit of a mess, right? It's not completely pretty the way they do things. Gulbadin, was not in their squad at the start of this. He came off today, but without that, it really was, and it's still the plucky little scores that they've been getting. But there are good signs here. I do think in terms of development, not playing in the qualifiers, which I'm sure they were very happy about, and then having 2 washouts is a massive missed opportunity for them. If you look at the amount of cricket that Ireland and Netherlands got to play, and it's really important because when you play bilateral series, especially in T20 cricket, it's very rare you play against a full strength team who is trying very hard to win. They're probably grooming a couple of players. They're probably trying some players in some new spots. They might be resting their better bowlers, whatever that may be. And so when you come to a World Cup, what you know is in a neutral environment, you're going to face an opposition team who is going to be trying everything they can to win. And more often than not, probably try and destroy you because they're probably thinking that Afghanistan is a net run rate potential team for them as well. So they've missed out on experience. They've missed out on, really testing their players at the top level. And honestly, coming to Australia for 3 games is a little bit meh at the end of the day. But at least they went out in the last game with a bit of a bang. It would have been awful if they'd been towed up here because I think they were disappointing in those other 2 games. I thought they bowled really well, and then they started well with the bat before that triple collapse on 99, but they still got it close. It's not nothing, but it's also not much to take home from a World Cup. So we'll go on to the Australian batting. So Aaron Finch didn't play today because of his hamstring. So it was about a lot of changes within the Australian lineup. It wasn't just him. Tim David was out as well. So everyone wanted Cameron Green to come in, and he did. And Tim David's injury meant that Steve Smith came in. That's about the least like-for-like replacement in terms of almost everything that those two currently bring to the team. Unfortunately, though, that Green only made 3 and Smith only made 4. So I think they faced 7 balls between them. So not a huge change there. It was a very strange innings from Australia. And they explained it. I can't remember if it was Maxwell or Matty Wade talking at the end. But they explained it that the pitch wasn't quite coming on the way that they thought it was going to be. And they obviously really wanted to attack. And then they got to that point around the 12 over mark and realized that that wasn't really working for them as much. They'd lost a lot of wickets by that point. They knew that they had to attack for the net run rate, but I think they got a little bit worried that they wouldn't put on enough runs to actually win the game as well. We've talked a lot about Aaron Finch's weird form for Australia. David Warner has had a rough time of it this tournament. I thought this was the first time he looked like he was going to make some runs and was certainly getting Australia off to a fairly decent side. And then he played it was a reverse or a switch hit, right? But what actually was that shot? I'm not sure I have a proper name for it because he turned around. And then when he turned around, obviously the ball was fuller than he thought it was going to be. And when it was fuller, he basically turned around and played almost... A forward defense is maybe the wrong way of looking at it, but he played a reverse forward push and was bowled. It was very clever bowling, but I'm not sure. It could have just been a situation where, Warner was obviously, they had the 2 fielders out on the leg side. He wanted to hit the ball to the offside. He turned around to get into the pinch position, and then the ball just wasn't exactly where he thought it was. But the weird thing was, had he hit the ball, even if he'd hit it hard, he would have hit it to where the 2 fielders were out on the boundary anyway. So the whole thing was very... weird, but he was certainly running between wickets like the old David Warner. And I think he's certainly a player who needs to run between wickets to get his energy more than everyone else. I mean, he was originally a hitter of the ball. He's not really that anymore. He's placing the ball. He's a very good player of spin, a very good manipulator of the fields, and a brilliant runner, a very aggressive runner as well between the wickets. He had the time today where he hit the 3-4s off Majid, but it's still really, for me, it was that sort of frantic running between wickets that I thought was the most interesting thing. But again, he didn't make a lot of runs today. I thought Mitch Marsh's 45 was quite good, and Maxwell played fairly well considering everything. If those 2 hadn't got away, it would have been having a look at how Afghanistan batted. Would have been interesting if Maxwell or Marsh had slightly quieter days, if Afghanistan would have had a chance of actually winning that. But I think they finished, that finish of the game outside of I think Maxwell might have hit a couple of boundaries at the end, was not particularly good. They scored not many runs from the final 4 overs. And it was a really weird innings from that perspective. They started really strong. They lost a bunch of wickets in the middle. They then decided to get a decent total, but then they couldn't kick on at the end like they probably expected to. They had Wade coming in at number 7. So there is batting in that lineup, but it just didn't look particularly good. They just look a little muddled as a team at the moment. And I think part of it is they came into this tournament thinking that they were going to try and score at 10 runs and over and, put pressure on everyone through the power hitters. And it hasn't been a tournament for that. Finch hasn't been able to get them away. There's been seam movement early on. and they just haven't had the ability to hit through the line and play the sort of cricket that they expected. It hasn't been big bash-like in conditions, and it seems to have really bothered them. Talking about Australia being muddled, let's go on to Mitchell Starc. He was dropped. Mitchell Starc was dropped. And I think, again, it shows how bad Australia has been planning for specifically the T20 World Cups, that their best white ball bowler is no longer in the team. The signs were obviously bad, and we've talked a lot about Mitchell Starc in the show so far. That once he stopped swinging the ball, he became a fundamentally different bowler. But he's actually also been struggling at the death for a long time as well. He just, if you go back and have a look at the final of the last World Cup, they won that game in spite of Mitchell Starc, and that's not what was happening in white ball cricket for a long time with Australia before then. He had been the dominant force for them, and quite often carried the Australian bowling when they'd really struggled, especially in one-day cricket. And we know how fantastic he was between 2012 and 2015 in T20 cricket as well. He doesn't play as much of it, and now that he's changed as a bowler, I'm not sure how he's going to actually get better again, if that makes sense. So if you have a look at this World Cup, this was the main theme that's coming into this third game. And they dropped Starc, but you can see that Cummins was going at about 0.7 runs and over more, and also wasn't taking any wickets. Hazlewood has been fine, but again, if Hazlewood's average is over 30, they certainly would want less than that from him. And he's going at over 8 runs and over as well. So I think part of the reason Starc was dropped was because of this combined thing. And if you look at the comments that we've had almost on any day of this show where Australia's been playing, most of these are probably from KKR fans, of course, but even so, there's been lots of questions about Pat Cummins' bowling. And I think that's completely fair. But I don't think that should overshadow the fact that Mitchell Starc cannot do the job he used to do. I also think because Cummins doesn't have a really set role in T20 cricket, it means that with Starc trying to find one, how do you fit 2 players like that into the team? I wouldn't say that Cummins has been, even though the numbers aren't great, I wouldn't say that Cummins has been massively worse than Starc either. There's no doubt that his batting is more handy in T20 cricket. The other thing is, and this is quite important, and we will get on to this, that specifically Cummins has been a much better bowler at the death in the last couple of years than Starc. So if you go to Australia's death bowling in the last 2 years, they're at the wrong end of this. And look, they're not the only, if the 3 favourites of this team, of this tournament, or 4, if you want to put South Africa in there as well, are on the wrong side of this. So a lot of the better teams have had some trouble with their death bowling. But being that Australia has Cummins and Starc and Hazlewood as talents, and England has had injury problems and India has had injury problems, I do think this is a bit more of a concern with them. And South Africa is the other really interesting one there as well, but that's for another time. So there's no doubt that Australia's death bowling hasn't been particularly good, and Starc specifically hasn't been pretty good, and that's why he has probably got the arse. If he was still bowling good at the death and he wasn't using the new ball, I don't think he would have been out. If you go on to the bowlers specifically, this is the interesting one, and this does show you the difference between Starc and Cummins. This is the Aussie bowlers in the last 2 years, just international cricket. Yeah, have a look here that Starc is going at 10.5 runs and over. That is expensive for someone like him. Certainly for him specifically, that's very expensive. You can see that Hazlewood is coming in just around the 10 runs and over mark. He's not a natural death bowler, although he can do quite well. Cummins, surprisingly enough, has been going at 9.5 runs and over. But the other pressure is not just on that you have 3 star bowlers and none of them are really doing brilliantly. It's also that Kane Richardson has been going at 8.5 when he's come into the team, and he's more of a death specialist. And then even more so when Nathan Ellis has been thrown the ball, he's even more of a death specialist, right? I know that there's a lot of people in Australian cricket who are very high up on Nathan Ellis. He gets incredible revolutions and drop on his ball, which makes it very hard to face him as to line him up at the death. So you can understand why he's been talked up, but they went for Richardson in this squad. And so with Richardson there, that's why he came in. He's obviously no like for like for Starc, but if they were looking for the better death bowler, it makes sense. The thing is that Richardson is a holding bowler. That is his main skill. And obviously, Starc at his best can hold, but is far better when it comes to being a strike bowler. And in this particular game, Australia really probably needed to attack a little bit more, but they didn't even feel confident in Mitchell Starc's striking ability at the moment. And so they went with the more defensive option here. It's incredible, though, to think that he might, Starc was the best white ball bowler in the world and is no longer used for Australia in a game against Afghanistan to strike. That's how far he's fallen down in terms of everything else. And we've done a lot of stuff on him in the mood board so far about him not taking the new ball and everything else. But I always thought his wickets up the top were a little bit overrated. Where I thought Starc was at his absolute best was the ability to throw the ball to him in the middle, and for him to be a threat with the older ball before the death started. And he doesn't seem to have that at all. So I think that in some ways, Australia were waiting for him to come good, and it didn't quite happen. But it does show that they were a little bit more muddled, especially as if they finally picked Richardson for the one game they needed to attack, and that's not what he does. Now, Richardson started beautifully today. Unfortunately for him, he did not end that way. And this also tells you how ridiculous these short tournaments are. Richardson's probably now only going to play one game. He's brought in as a death specialist. He's been a death specialist for Australia. He's been a death specialist in the Big Bash and a few, other franchises when he's gone to them. And he comes in today and he goes at 2 runs a ball. And that's it. That's his entire tournament. It's basically Rashid Khan getting a few away from him at the end is his entire tournament. And Afghanistan scored 52 runs in their final 4 overs today. So they brought in the death specialist, and it was actually really, really bad. And as I said, Richardson did bowl well early on. So it is maybe just that kind of World Cup for Australia. But just to show it in one more way, this is a percentage of the runs from each bowler for Afghanistan today. You see Josh Hazlewood, 20% of the runs. Pat Cummins, 13% of the runs. Marcus Stoinis only bowled a couple of overs, obviously that horrific last over. And Kane Richardson went for 30% of the runs. Even if they made the right decision, which you could argue, it just sort of went against them. It's almost the complete opposite of the last World Cup, where even when Australia made the wrong decision, everything went for them. These tournaments are short, and that first loss against New Zealand has just had a massive impact on Australia. And I don't think you would think that Finch would retire at this stage. It looks like Green comes in naturally. Tim David's going to be around for the next couple of years. Steve Smith, let's see if he can change his batting and make himself slightly more relevant for that team. There's some good young players out there as well, the Joshes, and a few others coming through. As far as an exit interview goes, they would prefer to have a specialist fifth bowler or an all-rounder, maybe Cameron Green, who can take that role so that they have a little bit more flexibility. But they're still a very good team here when it looks at talent. When it looks at roles and fit, it doesn't look quite as good. And the other interesting thing is, if they're going to pick 4 frontline bowlers and essentially part-timers who are not specialist bowlers to fill up that other spot, you have to make sure that at least three of your frontline bowlers are absolute specialists. And if you look at them at the moment, they're just not. Right? Hazelwood's the only one of those 3 guys of the 3 seamers where I go, absolutely. And even Zampa, as he currently is, I'm not sure that Zampa or Agar is a lock going ahead for this team. So there's a lot of questions there. And, there were questions at the last World Cup, but things fell in their favour. And that's how this tournament is set up. Let's go on to Ireland. And let's talk about Josh Little. Another T20 World Cup and another hat-trick for Ireland. The first team to have 2 hat-tricks in T20 World Cups. Curtis Kampfer did it in the last tournament, obliterating Netherlands' entire tournament in a moment there. And so it's certainly been a much better tournament for Ireland so far. You've got... You've certainly, get on the full details, but Josh Little came into this, and I talked about him a lot, and about how other teams at this World Cup, major teams at this World Cup, would have looked at him as a prospect and be like, that's the kind of player that we wouldn't mind to have. In the old days of England cricket, they'd be getting him over to a county, right, and seeing if he could qualify. Things have changed a little bit, but he's had a better World Cup than I thought he would have had. I thought it was probably a little bit early for Josh Little. I watched him a lot this summer, and he certainly bowled very well. But there are times where I thought he just hasn't quite worked out the best of his abilities. I love the fact he can bowl over and around the wicket so comfortably, which not all left-arm bowlers, of course, can. But he ends up with 11 wickets, which at the moment is second to Hasaranga. And an average of 17, an economy of 7. I think he's always going to be a bit more of a high economy bowler. Not that 7's high, but I think he's always going to be someone like that. But he has the ability to take a lot of wickets. And he's spent most of his time, obviously, bowling in the power play and the death. So that economy completely holds up. Hat-tricks in T20 cricket can often feel a little bit fluky. Was it Steve Wynn one? That might have been a one-day game, which was one of my favorites. But, we see people take hat-tricks and everything's called it deep mid-wicket. That's a little bit different here. He removed the set Kane Williamson with a change of pace. He went into the wicket with a cutter. Williamson mistimed the pull shot. That's the most normal one that we'd see there. But then he got Neesham and Santner with just terrific balls, tailing back into the pads. Good heat. Let's just have a look at this hat-trick now, Muku, if you could play the tape for me, please.
Goes again. This time finds the fielder in the deep.
May well have been a slower ball again into the pitch surface, just sat there. And Williamson's intent was good, but the timing.
Left-handed Jimmy Neesham has come out to the middle and struck on the pads. The finger.
Pitching in line, impact in line, and wicket hitting. Richard Cup.
Oh, wrapped on the pads. It's
Richard. Pitching outside of impact in line and wicket hitting. Stay with your decision out. Wait for the call. You don't spin, make your signal.
Richard.
That last one's just a really good ball, and I really enjoyed that. One of the games the other day, must have been Ireland's last game. They show those ICC highlights packages. I don't know if you've seen them, where they show a preview, a historic T20 moment from one of the old World Cups. Historic is probably the wrong term, but you know what I mean. A moment not from this World Cup. And there was a game they were showing where Alex Cusack took some wickets, and if you've forgotten him, he was a right arm medium paced bowler, canny skills, kind of nibbly sort of bowler, a very handy player. But it is incredible to think that we've gone from Alex Cusack's straight slow medium pace to Josh Little's left arm fast rockets. To think of Ireland having a left arm seam bowler, which they never really had before Josh Little either. I'm not sure if they had any before Josh Little. Bowling at 90 miles an hour and splattering the lower middle order of New Zealand is phenomenal. It's important to rate them on where they are, but it's also to remember how quickly they have become this kind of team. And it's phenomenal, really. Little finished with 3 for 22. He took 2 for 21 against Australia, 2 for 16 against England. It's not a bad return against the three of the better teams he's going to go up against. Also for him, I think the next really important thing in Little's career is for him to be playing in franchise cricket around the world. I know he was on the fringes and, was there and thereabouts, but he's certainly at a point now where I think he'll get picked up in more and more franchise leagues going forward. And I think that's really important for Ireland. All right, let's get on to the Ireland exit interview. So we kind of did an Afghanistan one, and I feel like I've done the Australian one now. So I'm flying through these exit interviews. In terms of T20 World Cups, this is the best T20 World Cup that Ireland have ever had. You could argue it's close to their best World Cup overall. 2007 almost has to be pushed aside because it changed Irish cricket forever. But if you look at the results, it's maybe not quite on the level of 2015. I think maybe pound for pound, had they got a little bit closer to New Zealand today or even upset New Zealand, I think this would have been their best World Cup ever. 2015, they actually had a fantastic one. But this has been a fantastic T20 tournament for a team that hasn't been particularly good at T20 cricket for a little while now. And if you look at the first 4 games, Raza got hold of them in the first game and Zimbabwe beat them. That win now looks a lot better than it did at the time. Second game, Scotland basically had them out of the tournament. And Camphor and Dockrell played an incredible 1 in a million partnership to get them back in. But they were fantastic against the West Indies. And that's important for two reasons. A, they're playing a major nation, a fellow test playing nation at the World Cup. It's important for them to put on that kind of show. But also that was the knockout game from that first group stage, right? And so at that point, we saw how they played against Namibia the year before. They were timid, they were afraid. Now they're against a bigger name team, and they completely stood up. And that was the first time they looked really, really good. They get out of the group stage, and the first thing they do is look a bit putrid against Sri Lanka. That was a really, really poor game. And I would say by far the worst game of the tournament from them. Of course, where did they go from there? They beat England. And yes, it was rain assisted, but they certainly played better than England and certainly played smarter than England in that game. They gave themselves a massive chance against Australia before an incredible collapse. And then Lorcan Tucker showed how costly that was when he got on top of the Australian death bowlers again. And now this game against New Zealand, where they were there and thereabouts, but New Zealand probably had them quite comfortably throughout most of them. 3 wins is their most at a T20 World Cup, but more importantly, it's the fact that they beat West Indies in England. I think that really matters to them. Not that the Scotland one doesn't matter either, because I think that's quite important, but it's the collection of the two major teams, and some of the signs we saw in some of the other games as well. You look at Ireland. They have a very good young core coming through. Mark Adair, Josh Little, Lorcan Tucker, Harry Tector, who didn't do anything in this tournament, might be the most talented of all of those. Curtis Camphor as well. I still worry a little bit about what there is around that, but having that core to build from is quite handy. Tucker is the one who has surprised me the most. Having seen him play a lot over the last little while, I just didn't think he was this good. I thought he would be plucky number 6, number 7, handy player going ahead. Obviously, with his second skill with wicket keeping, that could come in very handy for them. But he just seems to be developing so quickly, and he's gone from that sort of punchy lower order player to. I thought he was being used at number 3 because they didn't have a number 3, and that doesn't seem to quite be the case anymore. If he keeps developing in that way, considering Tector is quite clearly better than him, that's 2 very good players that they can put together. If we just have a look at some of the problems with Ireland, they have to get better against spin. So this is in this World Cup. The orange line is their average. So they've got I think only the Netherlands averaged less against spin than Ireland did in this World Cup, but they also don't score particularly quick against it either. So it's not that they've got a low average against it because they're trying to smash it everywhere. They're chipping it around and they're still getting out, which is a very, very poor. If you go, if you have a look at this, is their average and strike rate differentials, pace versus seam. So basically, what I've done is I've tried to rate their all the teams here, and this was before the Australia-Afghanistan game as well. But I've tried to rate all the teams here based on kind of what their strength has been in this tournament. So you can see that Pakistan and Australia have been very good against the spinners, and England has been much better against the paces. In fact, only England, Ireland, and Sri Lanka have averaged more against pace, or been noticeably better against pace than they have been against spin. But you can see Ireland is just like massively on the end of dominating against pace, which is great, but it's because they're not particularly good against the spin at the moment. This is just for this World Cup. So I did want to actually have a look at them versus spin, just spin on its own in the last 2 years. And you can see only Netherlands has a lower average against spin than Ireland does. And they're striking better than the Netherlands, but it's still not a particularly good place to be. And if you have a look at when they're bowling spin, again, they're the second worst behind the Netherlands. Now, I don't think there's any massive surprise that 2 European teams are not particularly good at batting or bowling against spin. It's conditions-based sport. We see the way that happens all the time. I would say that Scotland is down here in the good cluster, though. Now, Scotland have Mark Watt. They also have Hunter to here. They also have, forgetting the third one, Michael Leask. They have their leg spinner as well, don't they? Occasionally, Scotland just seem to have produced a lot more spinners, and they don't even always play Hamza as well. There's a podcast about that. And so, for whatever reason, Scotland are managing to do that. But Scotland also, I think, play spin a little bit better than Ireland. That's probably dipped down over the last little while. But we've certainly seen players like Callum McLeod and George Munsey and Richie Barrington at times play spin really, really well. I'm not sure I kind of feel the same about the Irish players. So there does seem to be a bit of a problem here. How can they get it to a point where they're developing in a way where they continue to create players who can either play spin or bowl spin? It's a really interesting thing for Irish cricket because it's clearly not their strength. Playing seam bowling and finding seamers doesn't seem to be anywhere near the same level of problem for them. And if you look at the game today, Ireland were going really well. They were 68 for none after 8 overs, but they just got completely paid back by spin. Look, and they're not the only ones. Santner and Sodhi, can get on top of you and have a really good record. They're not the sexiest spinners in the world, but they certainly have a really good record when it comes to these sorts of things. But all 4 of Ireland's top 4 fell to spin today, and that was kind of where their chase fell apart, right? They had a chance of winning, and afterwards they didn't. They were 103 for 5 at the end of the 15th over, and Santner and Sodhi finished with 4 for 57 from their 8 over combined. And also because they didn't have a specialist spinner, they had to use George Dockrell more. George Dockrell's bowling. Now, for those who don't know, George Dockrell went from being a frontline spinner to not bowling at all and becoming a batter. Because they're struggling so much, they're now having to actually trust him with the ball. And it's not working. They've got guys like Andy McBride and Simi Singh, who they didn't really particularly trust. It's just something that if Ireland want to be a consistent team, in World Cups, especially, in every tournament, not just in the odd tournament, they're just going to have to get a lot better at spin, and that's going to dictate how high their ceiling can be. I don't think it's a huge surprise that this is a World Cup that was dominated by pace, and Ireland have had their best T20 World Cup. So how do they find a way to be able to be better when that's not going to be the case in the future? And it's very rare that pace is going to dominate spin at World Cups, you'd think. So that's the Ireland exit interview done for you there. So let's move on to Kane Williamson, who has clearly been reading all of your mean tweets and seeing what I've been saying about him and everything else. And the whole world was getting on his back for his strike rate. I mean, rightfully, if we're being honest. And he produces 61 from 35 with 3 sixes and a strike rate of 174. It is still worth noting that he was about to run a ball for the first, 13, 14 balls. And then the drinks break happened. Whether he just decided to attack after the drinks break or someone said to him, maybe, skipper, you could have a bit of a go here. But Fionn Hand was hit for 11 runs in the 11th over. Dockrell was taken down with his part-time, and then Barry McCarthy was taken for 16 in the space of 3 balls in the 18th. It seems, again, the one thing I would say about Williamson is he does really, really profile as a matchup hitter. As in, there are some players who will just go when they need to go. He does seem to go when it favors him 100%. Now, there are certainly there are certainly critics who might say this was only against Ireland, and so we shouldn't overrate this too much. There's a couple of things I just want to point out here, but I made a video to show you what I mean. So there are some shots in Kane's innings that are just normal cricket shots. This is a bit of a mishit cover drive, but from a long half volley, normal cricket shot. This is a bad ball down the leg side. You expect a good player like him just to help it on its way. Finds the gap nicely, and on he goes. This is a short ball at the body. He gets inside this. Again, these are the sorts of shots that you expect, especially if his elbow's not working particularly well. Use the pace. This one's a little bit more interesting because he uses his feet, but it's still a very classical shot, and you see there's not a lot of power in it. It's more of a chip than anything else. But it does at least show some really strong intent, which he wasn't showing earlier on. This is a half tracker. Again, top quality player, anchor, gets a half tracker. A lot of what I've shown you so far is very, very normal. This is not. This is a slog sweep from a fast medium bowler from the slot across the line. It shows intent, but it's also a power shot. Right? He's hit this a long way in front of square. This isn't using the pace of the ball. This is hitting it over it. This one, even more so. This is a stand-up slog, and he hits this a long way back as well. Notice the actual distance that he gets. And there's no chip in this one. The swing goes all the way back around behind his shoulder. This is the shot that I sent to a couple of batting coaches and actually asked them whether they thought his elbow was better. Based on this, they thought right at the moment it wasn't bothering him. Yeah, so I suppose that's quite interesting as my window cleaner steps onto the roof beside me. Is when you're on the second floor of a building, you don't really expect someone to be standing beside you, do you? Yeah, so I think that was the interesting thing for me. When I saw that shot, I screen grabbed it and I just sent it to a couple of friends and said to them, what do you think of this situation? And they all thought they thought one of two things. Either that his elbow had improved, which it seems like a weird thing for it suddenly to improve midway through the tournament. I think what they thought, though, was that we often see players when they come back from a major injury hide it. And the very best players can hide it. Even if Kane hasn't hidden it completely well, if you look at his figures, they protect their weaker spots and they can still, score in their areas, which is the sort of the first half of that video, right? But there's no doubt that today he was fully flexing all the way through on those shots. So if that's the case, maybe he did it through necessity because again, they were, he was going at run a ball and something had to happen. But the fact that they were power shots was quite interesting. But even if that's not right, and maybe that's what he can do with his elbow, the fact that he's showing that much intent, I think, is really, really interesting. And if you think about him as a player in this tournament, if he has the ability to do that again against the better teams and the faster bowlers, I don't think there were many highlights against Josh Little, for instance, in that. If he can get to the point where he can flat bat Josh Little back down the ground, or someone of that pace back down the ground, he can also handle the moving ball. He can also handle the spinners, and he has the ability to bat long. That is a very interesting player in this particular tournament that is being dominated by bowlers. That's almost exactly what you want. And I think if you look at the player we saw early in the tournament, he was a liability for New Zealand. This player, if he can do this against the better teams and that elbow is fine and he matches it with that intent again, this could be a real bonus for New Zealand coming up to this part of the tournament to suddenly see that he's available for them. Anyway, that's the end of the written part of the show. Muku's going to play some ads, and then after the ads, I will answer a few of your questions.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
All right, let's get to your questions. Greenie says, what will Finch's legacy be? How to remember him in the cricket circle, among nuffies and among casuals. I think it's very different amongst all those three different places. Sorry, forgot to press the button, Greenie. And sorry if that was quite loud beside me. That was literally the window being cleaned there. I could have touched it. What will his legacy be? So he's a World Cup winning captain. He's certainly one of the better white ball players of his generation, in terms of runs made, sometimes in terms of just impact. I've gone through it a few times. I think there's a video I made of him recently. When he was at his absolute best, he was absolutely breathtaking and certainly one of the best players in the world in what we saw it in one-day cricket and we saw it in T20 cricket. When you talk about legacy, though, I think he'll be seen as a player that kind of flew a little bit under the radar because he was always opening with someone who was slightly better than him in Warner. He was a failed test player, which does matter in Australia. If you look at the legacies now of Nathan Bracken and Michael Bevan, they don't have the same level of legacy as players who also succeeded in test cricket. So I think that is part of it. I think within cricket, he'll probably become, I want to say a coach, but I think he'll probably work in cricket directly. And part of the reason I say that is his mind and his composure. I remember when he was at Surrey, they were blown away of the way he thought about cricket. And, you know, Surrey's got pretty high standards, and they've got some pretty, you know, they didn't say that about Ricky Ponting. or even Kumar Sangakkara and Ricky Ponting, they had a lot of respect for them. I still heard more about Finch. So you talk to a lot of players around the world, they love talking to him. And they love the way he thinks about the game. So I think that from that perspective, he's really I think his legacy will last longer within the game, within the players and the coaches, than it will outside. I think for cricket nuffies, he'll be seen as a really, really good white ball player who there was probably always someone better than him around. And I think for casuals, amongst Australian casuals, I think he'll be remembered fondly, but I don't think he'll be remembered brightly, if that makes sense. I think there'll be big bash stars come through after him. I think there'll be, you know, other Australian stars will updo it that will, you know, overshadow him. And because he doesn't have that test ability with him as well, I think that it will certainly be, I don't think he's going to have this big, strong legacy. But if he wants to, he could certainly get involved in coaching. And I think he's very well respected by people that hire coaches. And so if that's the case, he might end up building a bit of a legacy on the back end of that. But he's a fantastic player. You know, and not everyone gets to be remembered correctly. You know, when I did the history of Test cricket book, you know, Test Cricket, the Unauthorized Biography, if you want to go find it, if you can find it, you do realize that it's the players who do get remembered quite often get remembered just because they're that much better than everyone else, or there's a key reason why they stand out. And Aaron Finch maybe just doesn't have that level within him to keep his legacy. You know, really good IPL player, but they were better IPL players. Fantastic player for Australia, but David Warner was there. Fantastic white ball player, but wasn't a test player. So it'd be really interesting to see how that plays out. All right. Rahul says, Ibrahim Zadran cost Afghanistan the match. I think this one was put up before, but I just wanted to talk about that a little bit more because I can certainly see why you would say that. And I think if this was a more major team, I'd kind of be with you. If it was a team that had 7 top batters and a couple, you know, maybe a hitter at number 8, then I would be 100% on your side. But this is a team where you need someone to actually stay out there, right? In order to get those guys to come out and hit at a certain point, you definitely need someone to do that. Now, he didn't do it particularly well today. I don't think he cost them the match because I think if he goes out early, I don't think they get anywhere near that total. You know, part of the way that these things work, and we've seen this with Andy McBride playing for Ireland at times, is if you don't have a strong batting lineup, that one person who can just hold it together so you're not losing wickets at one end allows everyone else to attack. It's not ideal, but I just showed you a whole video showing you that their batting's not very good. That's why he's in the side. Yeah, that's their main thing. I saw Dan Weston on Twitter also say they needed you know, some sort of a seam bowling all-rounder. But I think their main thing is if they just had 2 batters who could average 30 and strike at 125, 130, they'd be a massively better side. Now, whether that's the 2 guys in there at the moment, I don't know. Anka says, what according to you is the reason Australia has been playing scratchy cricket throughout this tournament, despite having home advantage? Well, the interesting thing about the home advantage, of course, is that this is not usually when Australians play T20 cricket. So I don't think they were particularly set up for what has happened. Now, maybe they didn't follow my advice that you know, new ball wickets are more important than ever before, and that's possible. You know, I mean, England didn't, and they would have certainly, both teams would have had analysts having a look at this. Even if they hadn't watched my video, someone would have told them about it, and they would have run the numbers themselves. And I don't think I'm the only person in the world to have worked this out either. So I'd be shocked if they didn't know, but they clearly were thinking this was going to be a tournament. They were coming in smash the ball everywhere. That's why Steve Smith hasn't played. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is they've only lost one game, and they've played 4 games in total. So they played Afghanistan, Ireland, Sri Lanka, and New Zealand. So New Zealand game, throwaway game, fine. You get punched in the mouth by New Zealand and you lose. That makes a lot of sense. The Sri Lanka game, they were looking like they were trying to find some form, and there was some hitting at the end. The Ireland game, their death bowling probably at that stage is probably more of a concern than certainly that I'd factored in. I don't know how many other people did, but that was about the point. I thought they could get it. I didn't think they needed to be an elite death bowling lineup to win the World Cup. They weren't last time. By the end of by the Ireland game, it was becoming a bit more clear that was a problem. So much so that they changed their lineup and brought Richardson in, and then they beat Afghanistan in that death bowling lineup. And also, again, watching them bat, they had that thinking that they wanted to smash the ball everywhere, and then they couldn't. Then they didn't know how to get going again at the end once they had stopped. This is 4 games, right? 3 of which they won. Pat, you're right that they've been scratchy, but 3 of which they won. If you were 3-1 in a league where you played 15 games and you'd been scratchy, you would be over the moon. Because you're sitting there looking, we haven't played very well at the moment. We've already banked a bunch of wins and things are about to come around. The problem with this World Cup is it's only a few games. And so if you don't hit the ground running the way that New Zealand did or South Africa did, it's really tough. And that's unfortunately how the tournament is set up. And there's, no real way around that. We can't play it in a different way. But sometimes the hardest thing when you're working with a cricket team, it's not the planning, it's not being on top of things, it's not scheduling, it's not even injuries. All those things I can handle, right? The toughest thing is form. Because there is no way to guarantee that enough of your players are in form at the same time. And if you look at that New Zealand game, the batters and bowlers weren't in form in that game, right? They have some of them have come back, some of them have been left out of the side since then. But when you have so many players who don't fire in one game, there's all the tactics and selection and everything that people talk about on Twitter doesn't mean anything. Really does mean that you're going to lose that game just because too many of your players didn't play very well. It's why I call those things throwaway games, because you can't get a lot out of them. Since then, Australia's been trying to work themselves back into form. They've won 3 games. They haven't won them well enough, which is part of the problem. And part of that might be that, they weren't quite set up for this tournament as it was supposed to be, as I said earlier. But realistically, they are just, they are 3-1, and you can be 3. Ask South Africa, who were 4-1 in the last tournament, and went home. Oh, clicked on the wrong one. Bruh says, do you think Australia should have given Mitchell Starc a chance against Afghanistan? Do you think they will qualify? I don't think they will qualify. Do I think they should have given Mitchell Starc a chance again? I kind of think that if you've given him all those games and you need to attack in the last game, I don't see that as the time to give Richardson the ball. Had they decided earlier in the tournament, perhaps even after the New Zealand game, but even for the first game, that they needed better death bowling and that Hazelwood could get the new ball and that Cummins could be the second seamer and Stoinis/Marsh/Green could bowl 1 or 2 overs in that period, I would have said that's fine. That allows them to bowl Hazelwood a little bit more up front if they need to, knowing that they have a death specialist at the end. Doing it for this particular game shows, again, the sort of muddled thinking that we've seen from them so far. It's not that surprising to me. Andrew says, Cameron Green is talented, but does not appear ready for this level yet. Well, he hasn't played this level yet. How can we prepare him now he's established himself in the test team and will get very few BBL or other T20 league matches? Well, they were very careful with him. He was offered to a county this year. I can't remember who he ended up playing for, but he was offered to another county first as a batter. And the other county was just like, if he's not going to come and bowl, we don't want him. When he goes to franchises, they won't have that kind of control over him. I would assume that Cameron Green, based on the fact he made runs against India, in test matches and now also in T20 internationals, is a outside chance of the IPL. But I think the IPL is a bit more mature now than it used to be. If I was planning for Cameron Green, I would certainly try and make sure he has one full run of franchise cricket every year. If that is the plan, he's going to be a T20 player as well, and they want him to be a star, because if he can work it out, and for those who don't know, he's barely played any T20 cricket, and until he made runs against Pakistan, he'd never been any good at it. And he's still, I think he's gone at 10 runs and over with his bowling, so he still hasn't quite worked out the bowling yet either. But quite clearly, the entire package is there. But he's going to have to play it to get good at it. And if he's not, you're going to be in a very similar situation we see with someone like Josh Hazlewood and everyone else, where you're hoping they work it out on their own. I think they're a lot more interventionist with... well, actually, they're probably as interventionist with Green as they have been with Starc and Cummins and Hazlewood. And so it'd be very, very interesting to see if the IPL numbers sway that, or, even if you're an IPL team now, you might be able to get him for 2 or 3 different things. Can they afford to pay more than the Australian team can? That's also a possibility going ahead in the future, because he is that level of talent, potentially. But yes, I don't think he's ready at this level. That's why, if you have a look, I was never really... I think it was a better team with him opening than it was with Finch opening, but I was also not in a massive rush. The same reason I'm not in a massive rush to bring in, Dewald Brevis or Mohammed Harris or any of those sorts of players. It's really hard for them to come in and have that kind of impact in a World Cup. So I do think that you've got to be a little bit sensible with these sorts of things. And I understand fans, he's young and he's great, throw him in. It's not quite how it works at this level. Sports Saden says, which team's batting is better, Ireland or Afghanistan? Ireland's batting, I think, is better. There's holes in both of them. But I think I would prefer to have Ireland. I mean, Ireland have Balbirnie. I think Afghanistan would kill to have Balbirnie. Najibullah's probably better than anyone Ireland have, considering where Paul Sterling is in his career. Maybe not traditionally, but where he is in his career. But who else would you pick from Afghanistan's batting in Ireland? So none of the more anchor role position players would get into Ireland's setup. Mohammed Nabi obviously would be quite handy at number 6. If you had Dockrell if you had Najibullah at 5, Nabi at 7, maybe, and Dockrell at 6. But Tector and Lorcan Tucker, based on what we've seen in this World Cup, both look better. So, and Ireland then have the hitting further on. But to be fair, Afghanistan have the hitting further on. It's more the top order that I think Ireland has the better batting for. Having said that, if you're playing on turning tracks, I would pick Afghanistan's batting even without any batters. Anant says, do you think data analysts can do a better job than ex-cricketers as selectors? Often ex-cricketers have inherent biases and take decisions without concrete reasons. I don't think... So this is the way that this sort of thing is been traditionally thought of, right? You've got a bunch of people with clipboards, now a bunch of people with spreadsheets and algorithms, and then you've got a bunch of old cricketers. I'm going to be really honest. A lot of old cricketers who become selectors don't watch enough cricket. They don't take notes. They don't look for new trends. And they rely on seeing someone in the nets or seeing 1 or 2 games of someone and making a big decision on them. It's not that they don't have the talent to do that. If they watched as much cricket as many of us on this channel do, they would see so much, but they don't. And quite often, they don't want to. They played cricket. Their life was cricket. Now they've moved on to something else. Then they get these jobs and it can be quite awkward. The best case scenario there would be finding players who maybe at 25, 26 were good enough, but maybe, got injured or it didn't click or their career never came. But they also have the ability and the effort levels to be an analyst. That's what they're trying to do in America now, is trying to pair that up. And we've seen some very good analysts within cricket who have very good cricket backgrounds. So I do think there is a thing to be said for that. I think, though, that if you're putting together a team, you want a real mix of both. But any time you hire an ex-player, and I'd say this for almost any job, right? You have to be sure how much work they're going to do and how much they're going to put in. You know, the old Nathan Lehman comment, which is, players think an hour-long meeting is like their entire day, right? Do you know how many hours you have to do to actually do proper scouting correctly, right? And I don't think at the moment that players are taking that part of the job as seriously. It's the same with the media and the commentary, and we're not seeing former players become writers anymore. So we're already seeing a drop off there, and that wasn't the case 10, 15 years ago. So it's not that ex-players don't bring things. I mean, some of my best friends are ex-players, but when I get in a room with a really good former player, and so I had a chat with Matt Pryor recently, and he was basically saying, "Oh, all modern batting's crap, and that's why they're going out." So I started showing him clips of the wobble ball and explaining that it was fuller than when he played, that the angle was there, that everyone is bowling it now, and this is what's caused the drop. And so then he takes that information that I have, and between the two of us, we collate a batting plan to face the wobble ball. Now, before that, he just hadn't done the work. Matt Pryor was an incredibly talented player, right? And he loves cricket, and he's still involved, and he pops up every now and again, slagging off Sussex cricket, the way it's run on the county game. And I'm sure he'd love to get his hands on that. I think he just played in one of the veteran leagues as well. He's just not watching it enough. But once you get to that level of brain, and I've had it with lots of, one thing that I've got some friends, and they were former players, and they love just quizzing me on a player. I've just been, okay, how would you bowl to this person? So I come up with my plan, and then between us, we come up with this great thing. You need both, but you do need someone to do the heavy lifting and the work. And at the moment, I think that is where I worry more about the players. When you talk about inherent biases, I do think that analysts have inherent biases as well, right? Maybe it's different, but I certainly think that exists as well. But yeah, getting to that level of having everyone working together, I think, is the dream. And it's certainly where it seems now where American sports are going towards. And it's something that I think you should be encouraged. When I was with Scotland, there was a young person that they wanted to be an analyst who'd been a good player, but they didn't think was ever going to be at that level. I was like, that's the guy. He can work out spreadsheets, if he can do coding, if he can do all this sort of stuff. Let's tap into that kind of brain. I'm not sure if that actually happened, of course. Vickers says, why does Rashid Khan open the batting for Afghanistan? It's not Afghanistan that's the problem. I don't understand. I've said this before. He's a chaos hitter. Unless he just doesn't like the new ball, which is possible. Not everyone does. Darren Sammy, for instance, didn't like it. I think Darren Sammy would have destroyed in the power play, but preferred to come in later. I think the chaos method of Rashid Khan's batting makes a lot more sense at the top than it does when he comes in, when all the fielders are back on the fan. He almost went out today playing, I can't remember who it was. Someone bounced him, might have been Cummins, and he it wasn't a real shot. It was like a tap shot that went about, 2 or 3 meters short of a fielder out at deep mid wicket, and he didn't even fling through with it. With a power play, he can play that shot. With the fielders out, he could have been out at that stage, and the game would have finished really early on. So I think for a lot of teams that should be doing that, there must be a reason, though. It's never really made sense to me. Dimitri says, do you think Green struggles with bounce? So I don't know if you know this, Dimitri, but it's really common for tall players, especially players who were tall when they were young, to struggle with bounce. And the reason is, if you're a foot taller than everyone else, until you get to about the age of 16, no one can bounce you properly. So you're not used to the ball coming up at that point. And so it is a thing that with freakishly tall batters that they do struggle with the short ball, especially when they get to the international level, because it's the first time that people can ping them regularly with that delivery, and it is an issue, and has been for a very long time. I haven't seen it with Green. I never noticed it in my notes. I had pretty extensive notes on him from the first, bunch of tests that he played. I was more worried about that front leg, which is another tall bowler. A tall batter thing, but I didn't notice it. But I will have that look in the future. But if he does have a problem with it, I'm not massively surprised. Having said that, I was going to say that he's a tall batter from Western Australia, so it shouldn't matter as much because he would have faced more short pitch bowling than anyone else. But to be fair, Tom Moody still struggled with that. It's just hard to be that tall and develop your whole life. Essentially, one of the reasons those tall batters are so good is they can just get on top of the bounce and play it, and then you suddenly get to a level where that's a lot harder to do. Tom says, where does Josh Little rank on your left arm seam depth chart? IPL grade. I would think he's not IPL grade at the moment. It's certainly not starting IPL grade, but I don't think he's that far away from that level. I'm not sure he'll ever be a consistent frontline IPL player, but I could certainly see him as a player on the bench coming in for maybe half a season occasionally. He's a very, very good player, but I think he's not quite ready for that level of franchise cricket consistently. But he showed probably at the level where you'd want him in your team, and certainly maybe want him on your bench. I haven't done a left arm seam depth chart for a while, but I should. Jay says, Zampa is also making his case for an IPL return. Yeah, look, he's been good. I think we've talked about it in previous shows as well. I do wonder a little bit if Agar isn't the better option for Australia at the moment. And I love Zamps. I love the way he bowls. I love what he's done for Australian cricket. He's not a traditional Australian leg spinner. He can't bat, can't massively field. And yet, he's been an automatic player for that. As far as the IPL goes, I can't remember. I didn't think his last season was that bad. He's probably, again, I think that they have less international players on the bench than they used to. And I actually think that's where it affects players, is that sort of Zampa level. You probably only want Zampa for 2 or 3 games a year, right? But you do probably want him for those 2 or 3 games a year. And I think the way that the bench is set up at the moment is not as ideal for that. But there's no situation when I wouldn't want more players available, because it's more fun. And last today, Harsha says, what according to you would be an ideal format for an ICC event toward the best team? I mean, there is no ideal tournament format because you would have to play forever, and we don't have the time to be able to do that. We have to accept that when we have these sorts of World Cup tournaments, that there is an element of luck. And because there's more luck in the T20 game than there is in anything else, higher fluctuation between the results between T20 and one-day cricket. Because of that, we have to accept it. But we also have to mention it, because Australia probably weren't the best team in the last World Cup, and it might happen again in this World Cup. And those are things that happen quite regularly. And I think it's unfair to not say that. But it's also really good when we do see the best team come through and win the World Cup, which is probably, I would say in the 2016 tournament, the 2 best teams made the final, and the best team probably won, even if there was an element of fluke to them winning that particular game. So fluke's the wrong word because of what Brathwaite did, but to be in that situation and come back from there, they had played themselves slightly away out of that game, but they were the best team in that tournament, and so if they have their luck, I don't really have a big problem with them there. But yeah, so the ideal format would be realistically a bunch more games, and there's no way of being able to do that. And if we did it bilaterally, we wouldn't get the best winner either, because teams would rest their best players. So it is what it is. It's a good tournament. I think it grows the game well. We're going to get more teams involved in it. I've got no problem with having a World. I'd probably prefer to have a World Cup every 4 years for T20 World Cup, and then every 2 years have the Olympics, maybe even the Commonwealth Games as well, if you want to throw that in. I don't think we need as many World Cups as we've got. It's fun. I've really, I kind of built my career around the 2012 World Cup. That was a big change for me from a professional. So I've got real fondness for this tournament. But T20 is random, and you're going to have 2 knockout games in the semi-final and the final. And we've already got a very short sample size to see who the best team is. So it is what it is, but it's a good fun tournament, and I'll be back talking about it again tomorrow. What else did I have to tell you guys about? Oh, the Pakistan video. Probably not for Pakistan fans, but for anyone who's not a Pakistan fan. But I've gone to have a look at the randomness of T20 cricket. Is one of the reasons I want to look at Pakistan. You have a look. They have won 8 out of 11 games over these 2 World Cups, and the other 3 games they were all massively in front in and lost. And because of that, they're going to not win either. And they're not going to even make the final of either World Cup event, most probably. And so it does sort of tell you about that. So that's a fun one. And I'm trying to think if I've got anything else. No, that's probably it. I'll be working on some other videos. There's also still the Virat Kohli video if you haven't seen that yet. But thanks for popping in again, and I'll see you again tomorrow. That was a weird noise.